He was the quiet black kid no one noticed, until a racist teacher dared him to solve an impossible physics proof in front of the whole class. What she thought would humiliate him left her speechless, and reaching for the eraser. But before she could wipe away the evidence, someone hit record. What that video exposed shattered the entire school system. And that was just the beginning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Maple Ridge High School stood quietly in a mostly white suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, a town where everyone knew everyone, and the past clung to the corners of every hallway like faded trophies. Among the polished floors and American flag banners hung across the entrance, there walked Caden Holloway, a name almost no one said out loud. 16, slim and soft-spoken, Caden carried himself like someone afraid of taking up space. His steps were light, his presence quieter than the rustle of turning notebook pages. Every morning he sat at the farthest corner of his AP physics class, usually arriving before anyone else. He'd pull out a thick black composition notebook, pages dog-eared, margins filled with scribbles that no teacher had ever seen. Not once had he raised his hand in class, even when he knew the answers. Especially when he knew the answers, because he had learned something long before high school, that being right, while black didn't always earn respect, it often earned resentment. Caden's home life was a modest one. His mother, Erica Holloway, worked 2 shifts at a nearby nursing home. His father had left years ago, a quiet goodbye wrapped in unanswered questions. Despite the struggle, Erica always found time to support Caden's curiosity, bringing home old science magazines, watching documentaries with him on their shared laptop, and once driving 4 hours to a used bookstore to get him a discontinued textbook on quantum mechanics. It was in that quiet support that Caden thrived. In his bedroom, surrounded by stacks of notepads, he didn't just learn, he created. He began developing his own theorems, not fully formed, but astonishing for his age. He'd sketch out alternative interpretations of entropy, question the structure of time within black hole event horizons, and often write his own proofs in silence, unsure if they made sense but exhilarated nonetheless. At school, however, he disappeared into shadows. In a school of 1,400 students, Caden was one of only 11 black students. He had no close friends, not because he didn't want them, but because years of subtle avoidance had taught him where not to reach. Teachers called on him less. Group projects found him isolated. Even the kindest of smiles often carried that faint distance, the sort reserved for someone who didn't quite fit the vibe. Mrs. Caldwell, his AP physics teacher, exemplified this unspoken bias. In her late 40s, with perfect posture and a sharp voice, she ran her classroom with a controlled, authoritative air. To her, Caden was just the quiet one. She never learned how to pronounce his last name correctly, always one syllable off. To her, genius looked different, louder, more confident, and usually white. One Monday morning, after a weekend Caden spent buried in a particularly frustrating mathematical riddle about relativistic momentum, he walked into class exhausted, but inspired. He'd been up until 3 a.m. wrestling with an equation he couldn't shake. He scribbled all over his notebook, trying to manipulate mass variables across accelerated frames. As he slipped into his usual seat, he didn't realize his backpack had slightly torn at the bottom, nor did he notice that, as he bent to retrieve his pen, the black composition notebook slid out, unnoticed, and landed near the aisle. 10 minutes into class, Mrs. Caldwell moved through the rows, handing out a quiz. Her heels clicked with rhythm, until they stopped abruptly. There, just beside her foot, was the notebook. She reached down, curious, her eyes scanning the cover. No name, just a faded sticker that read "Ideas." She flipped it open. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages. At first, she assumed it was scribble, until she saw structured formulas. Real formulas. Some scribbled out, others rewritten in margins. She didn't understand half of what she saw, but she recognized certain integral signs, limits, derivatives, interacting with Lorentz factors, and equations structured far beyond the AP curriculum. "Caden," she said sharply, holding the book up. He froze. "This yours?" He nodded slowly. The entire class turned. She smiled, but not kindly. "Did you write all this?" He nodded again, this time more reluctantly. The classroom felt suddenly smaller. The temperature shifted. "Well then," she said, her voice turning crisp with sarcasm. "Why don't you come up here and show us how much you really know?" Caden didn't move. The silence dragged on.
I mean it, she continued.
If this is your work, solve something real. Here. She turned to the whiteboard and scrawled out a problem. One of the most infamously unsolved proofs in theoretical physics. Something well beyond high school. 10 minutes, she said. Let's see what you've got. There were chuckles from the back. One boy muttered, "Ain't no way." Caden looked down at his desk, then up at the board. One day, his secret notebook slipped from his backpack and landed near the feet of someone who wasn't supposed to see it. Mrs. Caldwell stood still at the front of the classroom, her hand frozen on the whiteboard marker. Her lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, only superiority disguised as curiosity. The equation she had written was one that no high school student, perhaps not even a tenured physics professor, could solve in 10 minutes. It was a quantum gravity conundrum that theorists had debated for years. But this wasn't about science. This was a performance, a silent message to the classroom, and more specifically to Caden. Stay in your place. As Caden rose from his seat, the weight of every eye in the room pressed on his back. His palms were damp, not from fear of failure, but from the spotlight that had always burned brighter on kids like him, not to celebrate, but to expose. The same teacher who barely acknowledged his existence now invited him to be publicly embarrassed. Yet something in him resisted retreat. It wasn't pride, it was pressure, years of swallowed injustice demanding release in the form of chalk on a whiteboard. Mrs. Caldwell had never hidden her subtle preferences, but she had never been called out on them either. She greeted students like Natalie or Connor with warmth, asking about their college plans or weekend trips. But when black students like Caden entered her room, her voice turned clipped, her eyes bypassed them, and her compliments, if they came, were often backhanded. "You're surprisingly articulate," she once told a sophomore named Jalen, after he gave a flawless presentation on magnetism. No one questioned it, not even Jalen. Because questioning meant confrontation, and confrontation meant being labeled difficult. This moment, however, was too public to conceal. Caden stood before the whiteboard. His hands hovered slightly as he scanned the equation. Time slowed. His mind did not. He didn't attempt to solve the full proof. He didn't need to. Instead, he started reshaping the problem from its base assumptions. He redefined a single variable, reframed its dimensional constraints, and worked with elegance, not speed. Each stroke of the marker was deliberate, not just in math but in message. He wasn't solving it for the teacher. He was making a statement, without ever raising his voice. The class watched in a silence that felt heavier than sound. Even the usual whisperers leaned forward, confused but mesmerized. Mrs. Caldwell stood rigid, her arms folded tightly, the smile now gone. She hadn't expected him to write anything coherent, let alone restructure the problem itself with confidence. Her plan had been humiliation. But what she was witnessing was disruption of the narrative she had carefully curated for years. For a moment, the power dynamic shifted. It wasn't just about the math. It was about the unspoken rules of that room, and how Caden had just violated them by existing fully in his brilliance. When the timer on her desk dinged softly, 10 minutes had passed. Caden capped the marker, stepped back from the board, and returned to his seat without a word. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes stayed on the whiteboard. He had not finished the proof, but what he'd done, redefining the variable relationships, hinted at a deeper understanding of advanced physics than the curriculum allowed for. The implication was clear: he didn't just belong in that classroom. He had outgrown it. Mrs. Caldwell moved quickly, walking to the board with an expression the students couldn't decode. She didn't say a word. She simply picked up the eraser and wiped the board clean. A collective breath was held. The tension didn't break. It tightened. Some students exchanged glances, confused. Others, especially the ones who had always viewed Caden as a background character, now looked at him differently, not with admiration, but with unease, because nothing threatened their worldview more than a quiet black boy who was smarter than they were. Mrs. Caldwell turned back to the class and announced that it was time to move on. No comment on what had just happened, no acknowledgement of what had been erased. But what she didn't know, what no one realized, was that a girl seated by the window had pulled out her phone, quietly, secretly, and she had recorded every second of it. Her name was Tessa Mullen, usually one of Mrs. Caldwell's favorites. Tessa had started questioning things this year, not just the equations, but the way certain students were treated. She hadn't meant to record the moment out of malice. She had simply been stunned by what she was witnessing, and instinctively hit record. She hadn't planned to share it. But as the class ended and students filtered out into the hallways, she played the video again. The clarity, the emotion, the silence, the erasure. It all hit differently on screen. She wasn't sure what to do, but she felt, deeply, that what had just happened wasn't about physics, it was about something much larger. Caden walked the hallway alone, that afternoon, unaware that the most pivotal 10 minutes of his life had just passed, and that they weren't over yet. While he moved quietly, the footage sat in Tessa's phone, a digital time bomb waiting to ignite. Mrs. Caldwell returned to the teacher's lounge later that day. She laughed off the incident with her colleagues, describing Caden's little show as amusing, even arrogant. She framed the entire moment as classroom control, insisting she had nipped it in the bud before the boy got out of hand. No one challenged her. No one ever did. She believed the moment had ended on her terms. But the truth, the whole truth, had already left the room. With a smirk, she challenged him to prove an unsolved physics equation in 10 minutes, confident he would fail. The classroom had never been quieter, not even during exam. A stillness hung over the room like fog, thick and unnerving, the kind that made every rustle of paper sound like thunder. Every set of eyes was locked on Caden Holloway, standing at the front of the classroom like a defendant on trial. But this wasn't a courtroom. It was something colder, more intimate, a silent performance of control. He held the marker in his hand, unmoving. The board loomed large in front of him, covered in the impossible equation. Mrs. Caldwell had scrawled with calculated cruelty. The problem wasn't just complex, it was a trap, a riddle from the bleeding edge of theoretical physics that had never seen a solution, a dare masked as a lesson. For a brief second, Caden considered walking away, not because he didn't know how to start, but because he knew exactly what would follow if he did. If he solved even part of this equation, there would be no applause, no congratulations, only silence, resentment, and erasure. He had lived this before, in smaller moments, an idea stolen in a group project, a question ignored while others were answered, a test scored lower without justification. Genius in his skin was never allowed to be loud. But then something shifted. It wasn't defiance, it was instinct. Like a locked door inside his chest had clicked open. He stepped forward and raised the marker. He didn't go for the top of the equation like most students would. Instead, he circled a variable near the bottom, the one that anchored the entire structure. His first move wasn't to solve. It was to challenge the problem's foundation. His hand moved with purpose, striking through outdated constants, replacing them with more dynamic expressions. He redefined the equation's mass-energy equivalency to account for relativistic inertia, then used symbolic symmetry to reshape the matrix into something simpler, sharper. Every motion was deliberate. He wasn't just answering, he was revising. The class remained frozen. Some leaned forward, squinting, trying to decode what he was doing. Others sat slack-jawed, stunned into silence by the ease with which he moved. Mrs. Caldwell, arms folded, tapped her finger against her elbow, trying to look unimpressed. But the furrow in her brow betrayed her. Caden had crossed a line, not in behavior, in brilliance. The room was beginning to fracture. Connor, one of the school's top white students often hailed as the physics prodigy, blinked in disbelief. He couldn't follow what Caden was doing, and that terrified him more than any test he'd ever taken. For years he had basked in praise for solving textbook-level problems slightly faster than others. But what he was watching now, this was something else. Something raw. Something unteachable. Even Tessa, still holding her phone under the desk, recording, felt her heart beating faster. She had known Caden was smart, but this wasn't just intelligence, this was vision. Mrs. Caldwell's grip on her authority was slipping. She knew it. The room had become a witness, and the narrative she had crafted around Caden, the quiet, forgettable black kid, with nothing to offer, was unraveling with every line he drew. She tried to maintain composure, but her eyes darted anxiously between the board and the timer ticking on her desk. 5 minutes gone. Caden moved faster now, transforming the proof into a modular framework that could be tested against known limits of quantum mechanics. He introduced a tensor field, rarely seen in undergraduate work, and connected it to a curvature matrix that redefined the boundaries of gravitational pull. It was far from a complete solution, but it was a trajectory, and no one in that room, not even Mrs. Caldwell, could deny it. The realization hit her hard. He wasn't supposed to be able to do this. He wasn't supposed to make her look small. The last minute approached. Caden, calm and focused, drew a final arrow across the board, linking the initial problem with his simplified theorem. It was unfinished, yes, but it was also unprecedented. He stepped back. The marker dropped from his hand and rolled to the floor. And just like that, he turned and walked back to his seat. No words, no eye contact. Just quiet footsteps returning to the corner of the classroom, where he had spent the year trying to be invisible. The silence remained unbroken. Mrs. Caldwell stared at the board, her face blank. Then, slowly, the color drained from her cheeks. She walked toward the whiteboard. Not in a rush, but with tight, rehearsed steps. Her fingers curled around the eraser. One student began to lift their phone, maybe to snap a picture. But Mrs. Caldwell was faster. She wiped the entire board clean. Every symbol, every equation, every trace, gone. She turned to the class, her voice flat and businesslike, and announced they would resume the quiz. As if the past 10 minutes hadn't happened. As if Caden's brilliance could be washed away as easily as chalk. But she hadn't erased everything. Because Tessa's phone still recorded in her lap. She hadn't meant to film it all, but her thumb had frozen on the record button. Now she stared at the screen, breath caught in her throat. There it was, Caden's entire proof, the silence of the class, the way Mrs. Caldwell's face shifted. Every second preserved, a digital truth the eraser couldn't touch. Caden sat motionless at his desk, unsure whether he had just lost something, or gained something he couldn't yet name. The board was blank again, but inside the students who had witnessed it, something had changed. Especially inside Tessa. As Caden dropped the marker and returned to his seat, Mrs. Caldwell's face turned pale, and she erased the board before anyone could take a picture. By the time the final bell rang that afternoon, Caden Holloway's moment of genius had already begun to vanish. Not from memory but from official record. Mrs. Caldwell moved with unsettling precision. Her composure, cracked during that 10-minute window of public exposure, had returned in the form of calculated vengeance. She walked straight from her last class to the administrative office, passing bulletin boards decorated with smiling student photos, none of which she'd ever noticed, looked like Caden. Inside the office, she requested a private meeting with Vice Principal Hurst. The door closed behind her, and her voice lowered into the rehearsed rhythm of professional concern. She didn't describe the event as inspiring, or even unusual. Instead, she called it disruptive, unwarranted. She claimed that Caden had aggressively insisted on solving a problem she had never assigned, then taken over the class in a way that undermined her lesson plan. She chose her words carefully, not too harsh, but just enough to plant suspicion. Disruptive conduct, she said, attention-seeking behavior, possible academic dishonesty. It was a pattern she had perfected over the years, especially with students who didn't look like the ones in her family photo frame. There was no mention of the equation she dared him to solve. No reference to the brilliance he displayed in front of his peers. No acknowledgement that the classroom had been silent out of awe, not disorder. Instead, she portrayed Caden as arrogant, combative, a risk to classroom structure. Vice Principal Hurst, a man who rarely challenged tenured teachers, nodded and made a note. Within an hour, a formal disciplinary report was filed. Caden received the email on his school-issued tablet later that evening. The words didn't feel real. Disruption of instructional time, insubordination during class activity, temporary removal from AP Physics. His heart sank. He hadn't even spoken out loud. He had followed her challenge. Done everything right, and somehow it was now being used against him. He read the notice twice, then a third time. The language was sterile, clinical, but beneath it pulsed something darker. Something that felt deeply personal. His mother noticed his silence at dinner. Caden said nothing, not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't want her to see the world the way he now did, as a place where even your brightest moment could be weaponized against you. The next day, he was removed from Mrs. Caldwell's class schedule. No explanation given. His seat was empty. His name, once whispered with newfound awe among students, was now wrapped in rumors. Some said he had cheated. Others heard he got into a fight. A few believed he had cussed out the teacher. None of it was true. But truth had never been the priority. In the counselor's office, Caden was told he would be reassigned to a more appropriate science placement. No one looked him in the eyes. No one asked him what happened. And his GPA, once pristine, suddenly showed discrepancies. An A in physics had become a B-. The system was realigning itself, not to reflect reality, but to erase the rupture he had caused. Mrs. Caldwell, meanwhile, returned to her classroom as if nothing had occurred. She mentioned to colleagues in passing that some students get too confident, and it's important to remind them who's leading the classroom. To her, it wasn't just about regaining control, it was about restoring order to a space she had curated for comfort, not challenge. But not everyone bought into her story. Tessa Malin hadn't stopped thinking about the video. She had watched it twice before bed, then again the next morning. And the more she replayed it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a moment of academic brilliance. It was a moment of injustice. She had seen the way Miss Caldwell erased that board. She had felt the energy shift in the room. And now, hearing that Caden had been removed, she knew the silence could not continue. That day, while seated in the back of her homeroom, Tessa made a decision. She uploaded the video to a private cloud folder and renamed it Erased Proof. She hadn't shared it publicly, not yet. But the file existed, backed up, protected, ready. That night, Caden sat alone in his room, scrolling through his past assignments. Everything felt hollow. His notebook lay closed on the desk, untouched since that day. It didn't feel like a source of pride anymore. It felt like evidence in a case no one would ever prosecute. His mother knocked softly and entered. She didn't need to ask what was wrong. The tired look in her son's eyes was answer enough. She wrapped her arms around him, held him close, and whispered that she believed him. That was all she said. That was all he needed. But outside that house, a storm was gathering, one built not from noise, but from truth waiting to be heard. Because in another part of town, Tessa wasn't the only one who had filmed something that day. Another student, a quiet senior named Marcus, who rarely spoke, had also captured the moment from a different angle. He hadn't told anyone, but when he checked his phone and saw that Caden was no longer in class, he started uploading two recordings, two angles, two truths, aligning. And soon the world would see what the school had worked so hard to bury. But someone had secretly recorded the moment, and they weren't planning to stay quiet. The internet didn't whisper about what happened at Maple Ridge High, it screamed. Within 24 hours, the truth that had been buried inside a quiet classroom had erupted into a digital firestorm. It started small. Tessa Malin posted a 30-second clip to her private TikTok with no hashtags, just the caption, "This should have never been erased." She didn't tag the school. She didn't mention names. But the algorithm found it anyway. By midnight, it had crossed 10,000 views. By sunrise, it passed 1 million. People watched Caden Holloway walk to the board, calm and composed, as a complex proof stared down at him like a dare. They saw him analyze, correct, restructure, not flinch. They saw Mrs. Caldwell's face, her smirk at the beginning, her paleness at the end. They watched the erasure, her methodical wiping of something that should have been preserved. And in the background, students frozen in disbelief. It wasn't just math on that board. It was evidence. And for the first time, the world was seeing it. Within hours, the video had been reposted across Twitter, Instagram, YouTube Shorts. People clipped parts, slowed it down, added analysis. Black creators stitched the clip with commentary on how often Black brilliance is ignored, hidden, erased. Educators posted reaction videos. Mathematicians broke down the actual equations, stunned that a teenager was able to apply such advanced concepts in real time. Hashtags formed like lightning strikes. Caden the genius. Erased Black excellence. Let him learn. Caldwell exposed. The comments turned into confessions. Hundreds of users, Black professionals, scientists, doctors, artists, shared personal stories of their own erasure, times they were passed over, silenced, disbelieved. It was no longer just about Caden. It was about all the Cadens the world had overlooked for generations. Mainstream media caught on by mid-morning. Morning shows played the clip with blurred student faces and voiceovers explaining the controversy. One outlet titled their headline, "Teen Called Out in Class Solves Equation Teachers Can't Explain, Then Gets Disciplined." A former professor from Princeton tweeted, "I've lectured on advanced particle dynamics for 20 years. This boy saw through the clutter in 10 minutes. That's not disruption, that's brilliance." Celebrities added fuel. A popular rapper reshared the video on Instagram with a caption that read, "Y'all erased Mel K. Y'all erased Malcolm. Now y'all erasing Caden." Overnight, Caden's name wasn't just trending. It was becoming a symbol. Inside the Holloway home, Erica stared at her son's face on the screen, in disbelief. Caden sat beside her, too stunned to react. His face, the same one that had been invisible for years, was now everywhere, but the praise didn't undo the weight he carried. Every comment of admiration was tangled in a memory of silence. For every person that now saw him, he remembered every teacher who hadn't. At school, chaos unfolded. Students flooded the main hallway that morning, eyes glued to their phones, whispering, gawking. Mrs. Caldwell arrived, to hushed conversations and stares that pierced through her usual armor of control. When she walked past the AP Physics lab, a group of students turned away from her in unison. Some laughed under their breath. Others didn't hide their disgust. The administration met in crisis. The principal, Mr. Trenton, stood before a room of staff who looked equally panicked and defensive. They had hoped the disciplinary notice would be enough to suppress the story, but now it had backfired. The district's phone lines rang non-stop. Parents were demanding answers. Alumni wrote emails. Local reporters stood outside the school gates. Still, instead of acknowledging the mistake, the district doubled down. In a carefully worded press release, they claimed the video had been taken out of context, that the student in question had a history of behavioral concerns, and that the viral content represented a mischaracterization of classroom dynamics. They framed Miss Caldwell as a veteran educator, whose actions had been misinterpreted during a moment of pedagogical challenge. The statement concluded with, "Maple Ridge High values all students equally. We ask the community to refrain from making judgments based on partial information." The backlash was immediate. People dissected the statement, like scientists. Screenshots of the line "history of behavioral concerns" circulated, with users pointing out that Caden had never had a detention or misconduct record. Others highlighted the phrase "pedagogical challenge" as a euphemism for humiliation. It wasn't just a bad look, it was a declaration of war on the truth. Within 2 hours, the district's statement was ratioed across every platform. Influencers made parody videos. Legal analysts weighed in. Civil rights advocates publicly called for an investigation. An education equity group released a public demand, full reinstatement of Caden's academic standing, disciplinary removal of Mrs. Caldwell, and an independent audit into the district's treatment of black students. Caden, meanwhile, remained silent. Not because he was afraid, but because he was still processing. The noise around him was deafening. Strangers were chanting his name online. News vans were parked outside his school. Journalists sent interview requests to his email, his Instagram, even his mother's work phone. But for Caden, the internet's eruption wasn't vindication. Not yet. He remembered standing in front of the whiteboard, feeling like every breath was a risk. He remembered how Mrs. Caldwell looked at him, not like a student but like a threat. And now, as her face was being dragged across social media, he wondered, would the world protect him, or simply use his moment and move on? In one quiet moment, late that night, he scrolled through the comments again. Among the noise, one message stood out. It was short, simple, anonymous. It read, "I saw what they did to you too, and I kept receipts." The school issued a press release, but instead of apologizing, they doubled down. The backlash came like a tsunami. But Maple Ridge's school district didn't brace for it. They chose to stand directly in its path. Armed with denial and carefully constructed deflection, their plan wasn't to explain, it was to confuse, to distort, to outlast the outrage cycle, even if it meant rewriting the story entirely. Their second press release arrived just 12 hours after the first one collapsed under public pressure. This one was longer, slicker. It opened with terms like contextual nuance and educational integrity, before launching into an elaborate justification of Mrs. Caldwell's behavior. They claimed the equation presented in class had been rudimentary, that Caden had misinterpreted the teacher's intent, and that the viral clip lacked pedagogical context. Then came the real spin. Without naming him, the statement labeled Caden a student with a documented pattern of classroom disruptions, someone whose past behavioral incidents suggested a tendency toward contrarianism. There was no proof, of course, no records, no citation, but the language was coded, precise enough to shift public perception, vague enough to avoid direct accountability. To the district, it wasn't about truth anymore. It was about survival. Mrs. Caldwell, meanwhile, remained silent. She had been advised not to comment publicly, but behind closed doors, she felt emboldened. The district's defense of her wasn't just professional. It was personal validation. She had spent her career operating in subtle biases, convinced they were justified. Now, with the administration shielding her, she believed more firmly than ever that she had been right to challenge Caden. Inside the school, The atmosphere turned poisonous. Caden's classmates split into factions. Some supported him openly, reposting the video and defending his genius. Others parroted the district's language, questioning whether Caden had overstepped, whether he had manipulated the moment for clout. These weren't just questions. They were accusations designed to isolate, to wear down. Teachers grew nervous. A few privately whispered support, but most avoided the topic altogether. They didn't want to be seen siding with a student now labeled problematic by the people who signed their paychecks. The district's strategy was working. Slowly, methodically, they were shifting the narrative. Caden noticed it in the hallways. The longer stares, the careful distance, the way some students stepped aside as he passed. Not out of respect, but out of discomfort. His presence had become controversial, not because of anything he had done, but because the truth he embodied made people uneasy. At home, Erica watched her son retreat inward. His shoulders slumped a little more each day. The spark in his eyes, once ignited by ideas too big for textbooks, had dimmed. She tried to fight it, made his favorite meals, left affirming notes on the bathroom mirror, but nothing could undo the weight of being publicly painted as a threat, especially when the world had just started to see his brilliance. One afternoon, while scrolling through her phone, she found a message request from a name she didn't recognize. It was from a woman named Arlena Brooks. The message was simple. I was in Mrs. Caldwell's class 7 years ago. I've been silent too long. Tell Caden he's not the only one. Attached was a document. A letter. Not a legal complaint. Not a social media post. Just a letter written in raw, unfiltered honesty. It described a senior year filled with humiliations disguised as lessons. Times when Arlena had been ignored in labs, penalized for answers later proven correct, and subjected to what Mrs. Caldwell called academic toughness, but which always seemed to land harder on black students. The most chilling part came halfway through the letter. She used to say we had to be pushed harder because college won't go easy on you just because of your skin. She called it preparing us. But what it felt like was punishment for being visible. Erica sat with the letter in her hands, her fingers trembling. Caden hadn't read it yet. That same evening, the district hosted a community listening session. The auditorium was packed. Students, parents, reporters, school board members. The tone was polished. Chairs lined in perfect rows. A table of administrators at the front, offering generic talking points about student well-being and professional standards. They didn't mention Caden by name. They didn't have to. The audience was restless. Whispers turned to mutters. One parent stood up and asked directly, why was a student removed for solving a problem? No answer. Another parent, a black mother of 2 boys in the middle school, demanded transparency. She asked if the district planned to investigate racial bias in classrooms. The response was a vague promise of internal reviews. It was theater, polished, hollow, and designed to wait out the storm. But just as the meeting was about to end, a quiet figure stepped forward from the back of the auditorium. She looked older now, in her 20s, but carried herself with familiar pain. Her name, when she spoke it into the microphone, echoed through the room. Arlena Brooks. She had driven 3 hours to be there. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. But her words cut sharper than any headline. She spoke of being dismissed, diminished, labeled angry when she challenged test scores, called unfocused when she asked deeper questions. She spoke about being the only black student in her AP physics class, and the first to be asked to switch out mid-semester. And then she said it plainly. Mrs. Caldwell didn't start with Caden. She's been doing this for years. And I kept quiet. I shouldn't have. The room went still. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the administrators, so practiced in evasion, were stunned into silence. Because the gaslight strategy had worked. Until now. A former student came forward with a letter exposing Mrs. Caldwell's years of microaggressions and racism. The echo of Arlena Brooks's testimony hadn't faded when the floodgates opened. In the days that followed her unexpected appearance at the district's listening session, emails poured into the school board's inbox. They weren't complaints from strangers looking to fan the flames. They were stories from former students, some now in college, others raising families of their own, all with one shared thread. They had once sat in Mrs. Caldwell's classroom and left it carrying the same invisible wound. Each message painted a pattern. Some told of assignments unfairly graded, without explanation. Others described how praise flowed freely for white students who answered basic questions, while black students who asked deeper ones were met with skepticism or silence. A few recounted how their confidence had quietly eroded, not because they lacked talent, but because their efforts were consistently minimized, their intelligence treated as an exception rather than a given. One former student, Marcus Delaney, now a data analyst in Chicago, wrote that Mrs. Caldwell used to joke about how some students just aren't cut out for AP. He hadn't thought much of it back then, until he realized years later that every student she made that comment about looked like him. His letter ended with a chilling line: "I didn't drop out of physics. I was pushed." The school board couldn't contain it. Social media was now ablaze. Not just with Caden's story, but with an emerging timeline. A decade-long legacy of microaggressions and racial double standards buried beneath Mrs. Caldwell's polished resume. A hashtag formed like a scar reopening. Caldwell pattern. Local journalists began connecting the dots. Graduation records, course enrollment, numbers, exit surveys. One report highlighted that over the past 10 years, black students in AP Physics at Maple Ridge had the highest drop rate of any demographic. Few stayed, fewer graduated with honors. Almost none were recommended for science scholarships. Behind closed doors, the district scrambled to distance itself. What began as a single accusation had grown into a historical reckoning. But it was too late. The public narrative had shifted. This wasn't just about one teacher. It was about a system that had enabled her for years. Inside the Holloway home, Caden read each story with a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that he wasn't alone. Sorrow that so many others had endured the same silence. For so long he had carried the weight of invisibility, like it was his alone to bear. Now he saw it for what it really was. Generational. Constructed. Shared. Erica, seated beside him, wept silently as she scrolled through testimonies. Not out of sadness, but from the realization that her son's pain had never been isolated. It was rooted in something older, deeper, a cycle that had repeated with precision. The letters felt like ghosts returning to testify, refusing to stay buried. Yet in the eye of the storm, Mrs. Caldwell remained unshaken. She continued to teach, though her classroom was now a site of protest. Students began arriving wearing black hoodies, with "erased but brilliant" printed across the back. Some refused to answer her question. Others left their tests blank, writing "Caden was right" in the margin. Her authority eroded quietly, like chalk against time. But still, she didn't apologize. She insisted in meetings that her teaching methods had always been fair, that the accusations were rooted in misinterpretations and social media hysteria. She cited her years of experience, her accolades, her awards. She claimed she didn't see color, a phrase that once served as defense, now weaponized against her. The district was cornered. A teacher once seen as untouchable was now a liability. The board scheduled an internal review, not out of accountability, but out of necessity. With national media watching, and civil rights groups mobilizing, they could no longer feign ignorance. But the most unexpected twist came from a source no one had anticipated: a retired janitor named Harold Klein. He had worked at Maple Ridge High for over 25 years before retiring 2 years earlier. In a handwritten letter, mailed directly to the school board, and later scanned and posted online, Harold recounted overhearing conversations in the teacher's lounge. Offhand remarks from Miss Caldwell about how exhausting it is to teach kids who don't come from structure, and complaints about lowering standards just to make certain students feel included. He described watching her roll her eyes behind black students' backs, mocking their speech when no one was looking. He admitted he had said nothing, that he had convinced himself it wasn't his place. But watching Caden's story unfold changed something in him. The guilt had lingered. Now it became testimony. His final words echoed like a confession. "I cleaned her classroom for years, but I didn't see what needed cleaning most." The letter went viral within hours. Caden didn't speak publicly about it. He didn't need to. His silence had already spoken louder than the district ever expected. The truth had legs now, and it was walking into every corner of Maple Ridge's polished halls. Uninvited but undeniable. The pressure mounted until the school board had no choice. They issued a public announcement. Mrs. Caldwell would be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Students cheered. Parents demanded more. But Caden didn't celebrate, because he knew the fight wasn't over. University Science Journal had just reached out, and they wanted to verify if Caden's theory was real. The email arrived quietly, hidden among a pile of news alerts, school notices, and trending topic mentions. Its subject line was simple: Request for Interview, Quantum and Youth. It was from the Journal of Emerging Science and Innovation, a reputable publication with global readership and a reputation for discovering bright minds under 20. At first, Caden thought it was a scam, but the credentials checked out. The sender wasn't just a journalist, he was Dr. Malik Thomason, a former CERN researcher turned science communicator, known for spotlighting underrepresented youth voices in theoretical fields. The invitation was direct, a 15-minute live interview about Caden's approach to the whiteboard proof, what he was thinking, why he approached it the way he did, and whether he had ever considered formal theoretical study. The session would be broadcast across the journal's YouTube and academic partner sites. It wasn't a media stunt. It was academic validation knocking on his door. For a day, Caden sat with the email, unsure whether to respond, not because he lacked confidence, but because he feared what visibility might cost this time. He had already been erased once, already punished for showing his mind. What if this made it worse? But Erica, sitting at the edge of his bed that night, looked him in the eye and said the words he didn't know he needed. If they're finally asking to hear your voice, make sure they never forget it. So he said yes. The interview was scheduled for Friday evening, 6:30 p.m. EST. It would be streamed live with real-time comments from viewers and post-analysis from a panel of scientists and educators. Word spread fast. Social media framed it as a rematch. The quiet genius silenced in school, now stepping onto a global stage. Caden wore a navy button-up shirt. No suit, no tie, just clean lines and a quiet dignity. He sat in front of his laptop at the kitchen table, Erica just out of frame but close enough to hold the moment. The lights were soft. His posture straight. His voice when it came through the stream was even and composed, a mix of humility and sharp clarity. Dr. Thomason greeted him with warmth and minimal fluff. They dove straight into the proof, Caden explained. In simple terms, how the equation Mrs. Caldwell had scrawled was framed improperly for modern quantum gravity applications. He described how he recognized outdated assumptions, and how his instinct was to reinterpret the mass-energy relationship through variable field modularity, an approach more commonly seen in post-grad theory labs than high school classrooms. Dr. Thomason's eyes widened. He didn't interrupt. He just let the silence land after each explanation, allowing the brilliance to echo. Viewers began reacting in real time. Professors, students, researchers from as far as Switzerland and Brazil typed responses like groundbreaking, brilliant restructuring, and we need to recruit this kid. Halfway through the stream, the chat hit 75,000 live viewers. But it was the second half of the interview that transformed the moment from academic to unforgettable. Dr. Thomason gently shifted the focus from the math to the moment. He asked Caden what it felt like, not just to solve the equation, but to be silenced afterward. The boy paused. For the first time in the interview, his voice hesitated. He didn't cry. He didn't rant. He simply described what it felt like to know you're right, and still be treated like you don't belong. To feel your voice rise inside you, only to be erased before it can reach anyone's ears. He spoke about how long he had kept quiet in classrooms, not because he didn't know, but because he feared what knowing might cost him. He spoke not just for himself, but for every student who'd ever folded brilliance into silence, just to survive. Erica wept quietly from the edge of the frame. The chat exploded with heart reactions, tears, outrage. But amid the flood of comments, one name appeared that no one expected. Dr. Eliza Barrett, head of quantum research at MIT, posted a comment during the live stream. This isn't just theoretical brilliance. This is a young theorist already asking the right questions. Can someone connect me with Caden immediately? Caden blinked. Dr. Thomason paused mid-question. The comment was real. Within minutes, an MIT representative in the chat reached out to the journal's producer. Caden received a direct message in his inbox offering a full mentorship placement for summer research, with potential for early admission consideration. The interview wasn't just a vindication, it was a catalyst. When the live stream ended, the video was downloaded, subtitled, and reshared across every platform. It reached over 3 million views in the first 48 hours. Educators used it in classrooms to talk about giftedness, bias, and racial equity. Parents played it for their children. Students made TikToks stitching Caden's calm explanations with their own stories of being overlooked. But amid the rising tide of celebration, the unexpected twist came the next morning. An anonymous account on Twitter posted a thread titled, "The School Board Lied. I have the emails." The thread included screenshots of internal communications from Maple Ridge's administration, messages exchanged between Mrs. Caldwell, Vice Principal Hurst, and 2 other staff members in the days after the whiteboard incident. The emails didn't just discuss how to frame Caden as disruptive, they strategized about which language to use to trigger disciplinary action that wouldn't raise legal alarms. One email read, "Use disruption and refusal to follow structure. Those won't get challenged by OCR." Another read, "If we mention previous concerns, even if vague, the board will support us. He's not the type to fight back." The emails were real. The district email headers confirmed it. Screenshots were verified by cybersecurity experts within hours. The internet's applause turned into fury. What had been a story about a silenced genius had just become proof of institutional manipulation, a deliberate attempt to dismantle a black student's credibility to protect a racist teacher's reputation. National civil rights attorneys announced they were filing for a federal investigation into the district's actions. A coalition of educational equity advocates scheduled a press conference outside Maple Ridge High. Caden didn't watch the news that day. He sat outside on his porch, the afternoon light falling across his notebook, which he'd finally reopened. He wasn't writing new proofs. He was rereading the old ones. As Caden looked down at his original notes, a notification buzzed. MIT wasn't the only institution reaching out anymore. The acceptance email didn't just offer Caden Holloway a scholarship, it rewrote the story the world had tried to delete. The subject line alone was surreal. Summer Placement Quantum Youth Initiative, MIT Department of Physics. The message was clear and personal. They weren't offering him a pity invitation, or a symbolic gesture. They wanted his mind. They had reviewed his theoretical approach, verified its integrity through senior researchers, and found something extraordinary. His proof wasn't just impressive, it carried implication. The equation he had half-solved on Mrs. Caldwell's whiteboard, once mocked and erased, had now sparked attention at one of the most prestigious theoretical physics labs in the country. According to MIT's lead reviewers, Caden's variable restructuring and approach to curvature fields hinted at a concept rarely seen outside professional postdoc circles. It wasn't just that he saw something others didn't, it was that he trusted his instincts to challenge the rules that had been written by generations of white men before him. And now the institutions that once ignored kids like Caden were scrambling to say his name. Within hours of the announcement, national media outlets released back-to-back stories. Headlines screamed across social platforms. Teens silenced in classroom now recruited by MIT. Interviews were scheduled. Profiles were written. Even Time magazine added Caden to their 25 under 25 to watch in science draft shortlist. He didn't seek the spotlight, but now it wouldn't leave him alone. At school everything changed, and yet nothing really did. His face was everywhere. His name echoed in hallways where no one used to greet him. But the energy wasn't all admiration. Some looked at him with envy. Some whispered as he passed. Some teachers who had never once asked about his goals now called him a brilliant young man, hoping proximity might mask their past silence. Mrs. Caldwell, once the unchallenged titan of the science wing, had stopped teaching altogether. Her classroom door stayed locked. Her nameplate was quietly removed. No official announcement had been made, but the weight of the pressure was closing in. Her silence wasn't stoic. It was survival. Caden never looked for revenge, but even he couldn't deny the quiet, surreal poetry of it all. She had erased his proof. Now her career was the one vanishing, piece by piece, email by email. But it wasn't just poetic justice. It was systemic rupture. Because while Caden's victory made headlines, a deeper narrative was emerging behind the scenes. At first, the focus remained on the boy genius arc. But after the anonymous thread of district emails hit Twitter revealing how officials had conspired to label Caden as disruptive and non-compliant, a new wave of questions erupted. Who else had they done this to? How deep did this go? The investigation intensified. Civil rights attorneys submitted formal requests for all internal communications related to student discipline across a 5-year span. Pressure mounted as more screenshots surfaced. Internal memos referring to black students as undermotivated, suggestions to reconsider advanced placement when minority numbers grew too high, and performance rubrics subtly changed based on teacher discretion. Still, nothing hit harder than what came next. Just 2 days after Caden's MIT scholarship went viral, an anonymous whistleblower, someone inside the district office, leaked a complete internal email chain. Not just one message, dozens. A back and forth between high-level staff, written in a thread labeled Incident Management, Holloway. The subject line alone sent shockwaves. It started 2 days after Caden solved the proof. the very moment Mrs. Caldwell had filed her disciplinary report. The emails showed district staff actively coordinating how to downplay the whiteboard incident. One message suggested rewriting the report to emphasize refusal to follow classroom norms. Another proposed quietly lowering his GPA to reduce academic standing in case legal attention arises. One assistant principal even suggested speaking with the school counselor to create a behavioral concern narrative that would stand up in case of media or legal scrutiny. They weren't reacting. They were strategizing. The leak landed like an earthquake. Screenshots spread across platforms, news anchors read them live on air, and national education watchdogs demanded criminal investigations. For Caden, the revelation was a gut punch. He had always suspected the system worked against him, but seeing it in writing, in bullet points, and bolded action items, made it undeniable. They hadn't just doubted him. They had tried to destroy him, and yet here he was, standing. The emails changed everything. The narrative shifted from personal injustice to systemic corruption. No longer was this about one teacher, or even one student. It became a case study in how institutions crush brilliance when it challenges power, especially when that brilliance is black, quiet, and unwilling to perform for anyone's comfort. The district scrambled to contain the fallout. A spokesperson issued a vague statement about reviewing internal protocols, but it was too late. Public trust was shattered. Multiple staff members were placed on administrative leave, pending investigation, and one resigned quietly overnight. But none of that erased what had been attempted. And for Caden, redemption wasn't just about MIT. It was about reclaiming the truth. He began mentoring younger black students at Maple Ridge through a new science equity program. He met with professors virtually, helping to refine his equation under the guidance of theoretical specialists. He wrote a guest editorial in The Atlantic titled "What Genius Looks Like in Silence," and it resonated far beyond academia. But perhaps the most powerful moment came quietly. Weeks later, he walked back into that same AP physics classroom. The room was empty now. No posters, no teacher's desk, just a whiteboard stained faintly with erased chalk. He stood there for a long time. Then he pulled out a marker and wrote the first line of the proof again. Not for validation, not for anyone to clap, but because no one would ever erase him again. But someone inside the district office leaked an email chain, one that exposed a coordinated effort to destroy Caden's record. The first email had been shocking. The full thread was sickening. As national attention focused on Caden's academic redemption, the deeper truth behind his targeting was unraveling in real time. The whistleblower who had leaked the incident management Holloway email chain hadn't stopped there. A second dump of internal communications surfaced, this time involving multiple faculty members from Maple Ridge High. It was worse than anyone imagined. The emails were dated months before the whiteboard incident. One message, written by a senior faculty member whose name had never appeared in the initial reports, read, "We need to keep eyes on students like Holloway. They start quiet, but that's the kind who flips when they think they're smarter than the teacher." Another, sent to Miss Caldwell and copied to 2 department chairs, referenced quiet disruptors and advised using rigorous grading to manage inflated self-perception. But it didn't stop at vague professionalism. There was language that could no longer be dismissed as coded. One teacher wrote, "Every year there's at least one. Black, quiet, smart, and gets a chip on their shoulder. Same pattern. Remind them early who's running the room." Another message from Miss Caldwell herself described Caden as overly confident for someone with a single-parent background, and warned that he might need a behavioral record in place before college letters go out, just in case. The implications were horrifying. Not only had Caden's academic credibility been dismantled deliberately, it was done with racist premeditation, systemic familiarity, and unapologetic collaboration. Across these threads there were instructions on how to restructure rubrics mid-semester, discussions about how to delay recommendations without triggering complaints, and most disturbingly, a list titled, "Watch List AP Students of Concern." The list was almost exclusively Black and Latinx students. Caden's name was at the top. The emails painted a portrait of institutional sabotage, carefully crafted and quietly executed by educators who were supposed to uplift students, not dismantle them. These weren't isolated comments or random bias. They were blueprints. These threads read like a manual on how to manage Black brilliance out of the classroom. The documents were verified by cybersecurity analysts, and screenshots flooded social media like a dam had broken. Activists, journalists, and educators were no longer asking questions. They were demanding resignation. Hashtags trended globally again. Educated to erase, expose Maple Ridge, and most forcefully, name them all. News outlets called it a scandal, unlike anything the district had ever seen. But for the students who had walked those halls, it wasn't shocking. It was confirmation. They finally had proof that their lowered grades, their sidelined voices, and their erased recommendations weren't just unfortunate coincidences. They were calculated. Caden didn't speak publicly at first. He had seen enough cameras, enough people who now believed him only after they'd seen digital receipts. But privately, in the late hours of the night, he sat rereading the threads over and over again, not because he needed validation, but because he needed to understand just how deep the betrayal went. One email haunted him more than the rest. It was a brief reply from Mrs. Caldwell to the principal's assistant. "Let's start the paper trail now before he gets loud." Before he got loud. That sentence sliced through him, deeper than any insult. It wasn't about his behavior. It was about silencing the possibility of his future. They had planned for him to be punished before he had done anything wrong. His only crime was being brilliant while black, and not knowing when to stay small. The district board tried to get ahead of the backlash by announcing an independent inquiry, but no one believed their timing was sincere. Community organizers mobilized, protests erupted outside the school gates, no longer demanding a single resignation, but the complete restructuring of Maple Ridge's administrative leadership. Alumni called for a statewide audit of grading histories, and lawyers began compiling a list of impacted students for a potential class action lawsuit. But perhaps the most seismic shift came when Caden's story inspired other students to search their own school records. In nearby districts, similar patterns were found. Students of color denied advanced placements despite qualifying scores. Disciplinary write-ups fabricated to block scholarship opportunities. Teachers who had mysteriously stepped down without explanation, now exposed in archived digital files for years of targeted grading disparities. Caden had sparked something far bigger than himself. And now, the system was panicking. Inside Maple Ridge's district office, a secret emergency meeting was held. Names on the email chains were identified, 9 in total, 4 department chairs, 2 vice principals, 1 school counselor, and Mrs. Caldwell. As pressure mounted, board members debated how many could be sacrificed to protect the institution's reputation. But it was too late for containment. That night, a prominent civil rights organization launched a full campaign titled, "No More Names Hidden." They released a petition demanding the immediate termination of all faculty members involved in the emails, not just for justice in Caden's case, but to send a message that academic sabotage driven by racism would no longer be tolerated. The petition hit 100,000 signatures in 12 hours. By morning, it passed 500,000. Television segments aired interviews with students, once gaslighted into believing they just weren't good enough. A young black girl who had once dropped out of AP chemistry at Maple Ridge, after her test was lost, cried on camera, saying, "I thought it was me. I thought I failed, but they planned this." Erica watched the news unfold from her living room. Caden beside her, silent as ever. She held his hand tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, the world might find a new way to hurt him. But Caden didn't look afraid anymore. He looked resolved, because this time, they couldn't erase him. Not with words, not with rubrics, not with silence. They had tried to write him out of the future, and instead he had forced the system to read its own lies out loud. Community activists launched a campaign and demanded every single teacher involved be named and fired. It began with poster boards and silence. But within days, the gates of Maple Ridge High were surrounded by a sea of voices. What started as a digital outcry had spilled into the streets, swelling into the kind of collective reckoning the district could no longer mute. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder with students, their voices unified in chants that reverberated through the brick walls. Name them, fire them, rebuild it all. It wasn't a protest anymore. It was a movement. Local news cameras set up tents across from the school parking lot, catching footage of mothers clutching signs that read, "My son deserved a fair shot," and "Brilliance shouldn't be a threat." Civil rights organizations arrived with printed lists of demands. The crowd only grew. By the third day, national figures had flown in. Lawyers, educators, activists, bringing microphones, legal muscle, and momentum. Inside the school, the atmosphere was surreal. Hallways once filled with casual laughter now buzzed with tension. Teachers who had stayed silent during the email scandal now avoided eye contact with students. Whispers flooded the lockers. Who would be next to step down? Whose name would be leaked next? Caden hadn't returned to school since the second leak. By choice. He watched the protests from his bedroom window on live streams, stunned by how many people were now shouting his name, not in disbelief or suspicion, but in defense. Yet the attention sat on him like weight. Every cheer for his genius echoed against the memory of the silence he endured for years. The praise was loud, but the pain remained quiet, unresolved. Erica had been invited to speak on behalf of the families impacted. She stood on a small wooden stage, in front of Maple Ridge's main sign, her voice shaking at first, then steadying as she read aloud the names of students who had been on the watch list. One by one, she listed the GPA drops, the fabricated write-ups, the missed scholarship opportunities. For every name, a mother in the crowd nodded in recognition. For every story, a student in tears realized they were never alone. The school board refused to appear in public. Their offices stayed closed, but legal teams had begun their internal damage control. 3 staff resignations were announced quietly in the district newsletter. No mention of the emails, no admission of wrongdoing. Just brief statements about retiring early or exploring new opportunities. It was a PR maneuver, but the public wasn't buying it. Then came the walkout. Organized by a group of seniors, Black, white, Latino, and Asian students, united. The walkout was a coordinated, peaceful act of disruption. At 10 a.m. sharp, more than 400 students laid down their textbooks, walked out of class, and sat cross-legged in front of the school's entrance, refusing to return until the district agreed to a full independent racial audit and the public release of all involved faculty names.
The image went viral.
A drone shot captured it all. Students forming the shape of a raised fist in the courtyard, fists high in the air, silent but unflinching. It became the face of the battle for justice at Maple Ridge, a powerful counter-image to the secrecy that had long defined its walls. Teachers who had once remained quiet now felt the shift. A handful broke rank and issued personal statements, apologizing for enabling a culture of discrimination by staying silent. A history teacher wrote, "I saw the bias, I rationalized it, I failed my students, that ends now." Not all were so brave. Some teachers fought back in whispers, claiming they were being persecuted for a misunderstanding. Others tried to separate themselves from Caldwell and the other exposed staff, calling the email thread a toxic circle they were never part of. But students weren't interested in selective distancing. The call was simple. If you saw it and said nothing, you're part of it. Behind the scenes, pressure on Mrs. Caldwell intensified. Her name was now synonymous with institutional racism. National think pieces tore apart her teaching methods, her grading history, her offhand remarks. She had gone into hiding, metaphorically if not literally. Her home, once the subject of admiration in the community, was now a point of surveillance. Protesters didn't go near her lawn, but they didn't need to. The truth had already reached her doorstep. But no one expected what happened next. During a media interview outside the school, a young blonde girl stepped forward from the watching crowd. Her school lanyard identified her as a senior. Her voice trembled, and her eyes were red. Reporters turned. One recognized her immediately. Savannah Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell's daughter. The camera zoomed in as she held out a handwritten note, not to hand over, but to read. She took a shaky breath and said, "I need to tell the truth." Everyone froze. She explained that for years she had watched her mother complain about certain students, heard her talk about how some kids just needed to be knocked down a few pegs, and once even overheard a call with a colleague where her mother said, "We can't let these kids think they're on our level. They'll get too comfortable." Savannah confessed she had tried to ignore it. Tried to convince herself it was just teacher talk. But when the emails leaked and Caden's story went public, she saw the damage firsthand. The patterns, the years of bias, the lies she had been raised to normalize. Her voice cracked as she said, "She told me not to worry about kids like Caden. She said they come and go, but they don't change the system." She was wrong. A gasp rippled through the crowd. One reporter asked, "Do you think your mom should be fired?" Savannah hesitated, then nodded. The footage exploded online. The image of a daughter publicly acknowledging her mother's racism struck deeper than any document or protest. It humanized the fallout. It exposed how generational bias wasn't just institutional. It was inherited, absorbed, and often carried in silence by those too scared to speak. But Savannah's moment broke that silence. And now the district's defenses were crumbling, from the inside out. Mrs. Caldwell's daughter, a senior, broke down in tears and confessed something shocking to a reporter. The video of Savannah Caldwell's trembling confession shattered what little remained of her mother's professional armor. As the clip spread across platforms, Instagram Reels, TikTok stitches, primetime news segments, the world now saw what Maple Ridge had tried for years to keep hidden. Racism, not as accident but as inheritance. A teacher's prejudice exposed by her own daughter wasn't just scandalous, it was historic. It pierced the district's defenses in a way no email leak or protest chant ever could. Savannah's words carried a different weight because they weren't speculative. They were firsthand. She spoke not as an outsider but as someone who had lived behind the same walls where the bias was nurtured and normalized. In her now viral statement, she admitted that her mother often mocked the speech patterns of black students at dinner, that she joked about names, rolled her eyes at those TikTok kids, and dismissed any black student success as a fluke or extra credit inflation. Savannah recalled her mother telling her not to worry about making black classmates feel included because they're used to being on the outside. Those lines burned through the screen like acid, and though Mrs. Caldwell issued a public denial just 12 hours later, claiming her daughter was emotionally manipulated by online outrage, the world had already chosen its truth. No carefully worded statement could erase the tone of Savannah's voice, the pain behind her hesitation, or the conviction in her tearful delivery. Denial only made things worse. The backlash was instant and unrelenting. Educators across the country condemned Mrs. Caldwell's defense, pointing out that discrediting one's own child was not just unethical, it was desperate. The community that had once celebrated her tenure now demanded her termination. Even longtime defenders within the school's alumni circle began retracting past praise. Her name was removed from a planned dedication wall. A scholarship she once funded through the PTA was renamed by unanimous vote. Inside the Caldwell household, tension turned cold. Local reporters hovered near their lawn, but no one came out. Neighbors whispered. Former friends stopped calling. Savannah, now isolated from both her mother and her former social circle, quietly transferred out of Maple Ridge to complete her final semester elsewhere. But before she left, she submitted one final statement to the school paper, where she wrote, "I can't erase what she did, but I can stop being silent about it." Meanwhile, Caden's life took yet another turn. The viral clip of Savannah's statement reached millions within a day, and with it came mounting public pressure for formal consequences. Civil rights attorneys called on the district to expedite its investigation. Education equity groups began releasing their own reports detailing how teacher-family ideology often bled into classroom policy. People were no longer just talking about Miss Caldwell. They were talking about how unchecked bias passed down in private homes silently shaped institutional culture. For Caden, the news hit like waves. Some moments brought a strange sense of justice. Others reopened the pain. Hearing Savannah describe her mother's language, the same woman who had stood before him, daring him to fail, felt like being told something he had always suspected, but was never allowed to prove. And now that proof had a name, a face, a daughter with nothing left to protect but the truth. But the most shocking twist came 3 days later, when the Maple Ridge School Board released a cryptic press release late at night. It stated that an emergency closed-door meeting had been called in response to ongoing findings regarding faculty conduct and student harm. What made the announcement different and historic was a single line at the bottom of the memo. In acknowledgement of recent events, the board has invited student Caden Holloway to attend the meeting and offer remarks regarding his experience. The school board had never invited a student to such a session, especially not one in the center of the controversy. The decision made headlines immediately. Journalists speculated whether it was a genuine gesture or performative damage control. But for Caden, it didn't matter. This was his first chance to speak. Not in the classroom, not on a live stream, but in front of the very people who once rubber-stamped the erasure of his brilliance. He sat in silence after reading the memo. Across from him, Erica gently reached for his hand. "Are you ready?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, because what he felt wasn't fear or pride. It was something heavier. A responsibility that had grown larger than him. This wasn't just about defending his name anymore. It was about every kid who had been marked before they ever made a mistake. About every grade shaved down to teach them humility. About every proof, every idea, every spark that had been wiped clean because it came from the wrong skin. Caden wasn't just going to show up. He was going to speak. And this time, no one was going to erase what he had to say. The school board announced an emergency closed-door meeting, and Caden was invited to attend. The boardroom at Maple Ridge District Headquarters had never felt so claustrophobic. A long U-shaped table sat beneath harsh fluorescent lighting, its polished surface reflecting the anxiety in the room. At the far end, 7 board members shuffled papers and avoided one another's eyes. Cameras were not allowed. Reporters had been barred, but the room was anything but quiet. Behind the glass doors stood community leaders, parents, students, and civil rights attorneys, their presence a reminder that this meeting might be closed, but it wasn't private. At the center of it all sat Caden Holloway. He didn't come alone. On either side of him were Erica, steady in her silence, and Miss Raquel Morris, a civil rights attorney from the Education Equity Legal Alliance, who had taken on his case pro bono. Other chairs around the room were occupied by community organizers, representatives from 2 national watchdog groups, and even a black retired principal from a nearby district who had volunteered to testify on systemic discrimination in suburban schools. Caden's composure didn't waver. He had no papers, no pre-written speech, just a folder in front of him, containing copies of the leaked emails, his original test scores, the disciplinary report that had nearly derailed his academic record, and the photo of the erased whiteboard someone had finally recovered from the classroom's security footage archive. Across from him, the board's chairperson, Judith Langley, adjusted her glasses. A longtime figure in Maple Ridge education, she had built her career on polished speeches and reputation management. Her eyes scanned Caden briefly, before turning to the rest of the room. "This meeting," she began, "is to determine the appropriate administrative response to the recent controversies involving faculty misconduct, alleged racial discrimination, and the student known in public media." "You can say my name," Caden interrupted calmly. "It's already been said everywhere else." A pause. Langley nodded, but her discomfort was visible. The temperature in the room shifted. Ms. Morris stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With deliberate clarity, she began outlining the case. Not as an emotional appeal, but as an indictment. She presented the documented grade tampering, the strategic behavioral entries, the communications that used phrases like, "Start the paper trail now," and "He's not the type to fight back." With every slide projected onto the portable screen, another piece of the district's foundation crumbled. Then came the testimonials. One by one, parents spoke. A father of a former student who had left AP Physics after being falsely accused of cheating. A mother who had spent 3 years asking why her son never got recommendation letters, despite straight A's. A teacher who had left the district out of guilt, and now admitted she had once overheard Mrs. Caldwell referring to Caden as another one of those affirmative action babies. Each testimony cracked the room further, but when it was Caden's turn to speak, the silence fell thick. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. He simply opened the folder, pulled out the original disciplinary form, the one that had labeled him disruptive, and held it up. "This," he said quietly, "was written before I ever raised my voice, before I asked questions, before I stepped out of line." He looked around the table. "You called me a disruption because I did something none of you expected. I solved something I wasn't supposed to. And when that happened, you didn't ask how. You asked how to stop me." A murmur stirred in the back row. Langley shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You said I was arrogant, but I never even spoke. You said I had behavioral patterns, but I had perfect attendance. What pattern were you tracking?" He laid down the photo of the whiteboard. "You erased me. Literally. And now, after all this, I'm the one sitting here, proving myself again." There were no tears, no yelling, just razor-sharp truth, spoken so plainly that it left no room for misinterpretation. Langley cleared her throat, clearly rattled. She turned to her fellow board members. The final item on the agenda was the vote. The options were twofold. 1. Immediately terminate Mrs. Caldwell and any faculty directly tied to the leaked emails. Or 2. Defer the decision pending further review, effectively stalling until the media cycle moved on. The board began voting. One by one, hands raised. 2 for immediate action, 1 against, 2 for deferral. It came down to the 6th vote. A younger board member named Darnell Pierce. He had been quiet the entire meeting, his expression unreadable. When Langley called his name, he looked across the table, then down at Caden. The room held its breath. "I abstain," he said. Gasps rippled around the room. Abstaining wasn't neutral. It was a fracture. A refusal to support either denial or justice. A sign that even with truth laid bare, some chose self-preservation. Langley called for the final vote. Her own. and everyone knew which way she'd go. Deferred, she announced. Chaos followed. Some in the room stood and shouted. Parents protested, voices rising in anger. One attorney threatened immediate legal escalation. Caden sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He had exposed everything, but still they had found a way to delay. Outside the building, protesters waited for answers. They were about to get more than they expected. When the board finally voted, a shocking abstention changed everything. The boardroom door opened to chaos. Cameras snapped. Microphones surged forward. Protesters pressed against the steps like a dam about to break. And then the news broke, not from a press release or carefully curated statement, but from the mouths of parents who had sat in the meeting and walked out ahead of the board's slow official channels. Mrs. Caldwell had been terminated, effective immediately. 3 other faculty members named in the original email thread were placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. The district's attempt to defer had buckled under public pressure within hours of the vote. Justice had found a crack, and it pushed through. Outside, cheers erupted. It wasn't just about one teacher. It was about all the damage her presence had allowed. For students who had spent years shrinking inside classrooms, afraid to raise their hands, it was a moment of recognition. For parents who had written polite emails that were never answered, it was vindication. Inside Maple Ridge, silence hung in every hallway. Mrs. Caldwell's nameplate was removed by custodians under the watchful gaze of administrators. Her office was boxed up by district HR, not with ceremony, but with quiet urgency. Photos came down. Plaques were stripped from the walls. Her tenure, once celebrated as the backbone of the science department, had become radioactive. Staff treaded carefully, like walking across cracked ice. But for Caden Holloway, the noise outside didn't match the stillness inside him.
He didn't cheer. He didn't cry.
He stood at the edge of the parking lot, his backpack slung over his shoulder, and watched as students and supporters formed a wall of solidarity behind him. In his hand, he held a manila folder. Inside were the final copies of the forms that reversed his disciplinary record, reinstated his GPA, and officially removed all academic penalties from his transcript. It was done, on paper at least. But the scars weren't. Caden's notebook, the one Mrs. Caldwell had once erased like a nuisance, had now been digitized and shared with 2 university departments. MIT had confirmed it would be used as part of a larger research study on unconventional theoretical approaches in youth science education. Other institutions requested access. One journal even offered to co-publish his process with the help of a doctoral student. The very thing once used to humiliate him had become a symbol of resilience and brilliance no system could contain. He walked across campus like someone learning to carry his own name again. Teachers greeted him with a new tone, some out of guilt, others out of admiration, but he trusted few of them. Respect born from exposure was not the same as respect earned when no one's watching. He knew that. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Education's Civil Rights Division launched a formal Title VI investigation into Maple Ridge School District. What began with leaked emails had snowballed into a case that could redefine how systemic bias is tracked, measured, and held accountable in public schools. Investigators were already interviewing former students. Records were being pulled. Audits began. A culture that had thrived in shadows was finally under the microscope. And yet, as Caden walked down the school's front steps, the same steps where protest had erupted just a week earlier, his phone buzzed. Unknown caller. He hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, cold, and clipped. This is Jonathan Mercer, legal counsel for Mrs. Caldwell. This is a formal notice that a defamation suit is being filed against your son for reputational damage and emotional distress. Caden's face didn't flinch. Erica, who stood beside him, leaned in slightly, sensing the shift in his posture. Caden held the phone away for a moment, letting the words settle in the space between them like smoke. They're suing? Erica whispered. He nodded slowly. The voice on the phone continued. Something about statements made during the interview. Damage to her career. Irreparable harm from social media attention. The irony was suffocating. The same woman who had tried to silence him was now accusing him of speaking too loudly. But Caden said nothing. He simply ended the call. It wasn't fear that filled him. It was something colder. Clarity. The kind that came when you realized the system didn't end with a boardroom vote. The fight wasn't over. Mrs. Caldwell had lost her position. But she hadn't lost her belief that Caden should have never risen in the first place. The lawsuit wasn't about justice. It was revenge. But as Caden left the building, he received a call from someone claiming they were Mrs. Caldwell's lawyer, and they were suing him for defamation. The headlines came faster than the paperwork. Teacher who erased genius now sues him for defamation. It sounded like a joke, a headline from a satirical site, but it was real. By the time the defamation lawsuit against Caden Holloway became public knowledge, the media had already latched on. Outlets from coast to coast ran think pieces on the absurdity of a teacher, exposed for racist misconduct, now trying to reclaim her legacy by blaming the student she had targeted. Mrs. Caldwell's legal team framed the case as reputational restoration. They claimed Caden's interviews had exaggerated the harm. They argued that the viral videos had misrepresented her classroom intent. They cited emotional suffering, loss of livelihood, and online harassment. Her lawyer, Jonathan Mercer, presented her not as a racist educator, but as a woman unfairly villainized by digital culture. It was a Hail Mary and everyone knew it. But Caden's defense wasn't just airtight. It was poetic. Every piece of evidence was already public. The emails, the grade tampering, the surveillance footage, the disciplinary fabrications. Even Savannah Caldwell's testimony stood as a damning confirmation of her mother's mindset. Raquel Morris, Caden's attorney, framed the defense not as a rebuttal, but as a declaration. This is not a story of defamation. This is a story of documentation. The trial itself became a media event. People camped outside the courthouse. Protesters held signs reading, "You can't sue the truth," and "Erase racism, not Caden." Inside the courtroom, the tension ran deep. Mrs. Caldwell sat stone-faced, dressed in grays, her eyes betraying nothing. Caden, now 17, sat beside his mother, calm but visibly changed. He didn't look like a kid trying to prove himself anymore. He looked like a young man who had already survived a storm. During testimony, Caden spoke only when necessary. He didn't perform. He didn't pontificate. He simply recounted what happened. The notebook, the dare, the erasure, the aftermath. When shown the original disciplinary slip, he paused, took a breath, and said, "That piece of paper almost changed my life. But it wasn't the truth. This trial is what truth looks like." Mrs. Caldwell took the stand on the third day. Her voice was steady, but her words stumbled. She tried to paint Caden as eager for attention, misinterpreting classroom dynamics, and taking things out of context. But under cross-examination, her contradictions unraveled. She denied using racially charged language, until her daughter's recorded interview was played back in full. She insisted she never meant to erase his work, until the boardroom photo of the whiteboard in mid-erasure was shown on screen. Each denial dug deeper into her own undoing. The courtroom was silent when the jury returned. It took less than 4 hours. Unanimous verdict. Caden Holloway had not defamed anyone. His statements were protected by truth, fact, and public interest. The court not only dismissed the case, it issued a written opinion that would go on to be cited in future legal battles over student rights. The opinion stated clearly, in an age where institutions often protect themselves before protecting students, the right of a student to speak out against systemic harm, when backed by evidence, is not only protected speech, it is essential speech. Caden had done more than win. He had made legal history. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted. Reporters swarmed. Supporters cried. A mural artist painted his face on the side of a downtown youth center with the words, "They tried to erase him." But Caden didn't linger in the noise. He walked out slowly, hand in his mother's. No smile, just stillness. As though every part of him understood that survival wasn't a celebration. It was a responsibility. Cameras clicked. Microphones hovered. He spoke only once. "I told the truth. That's all I ever did." As he stepped onto the sidewalk, one final twist waited for him. A man in a tailored suit approached. Not a journalist. Not an activist. He held out a card. "Senior Executive, Veritas Pictures. We'd like to option your story for a film," he said. "But only if you're the one who tells it." Caden looked at the card. Then looked at the world. As Caden walked out of the courthouse, a major film studio approached him with a deal to tell his story on his terms. If you've ever been overlooked, unheard, or made to feel small for simply being who you are, then you know Caden's story isn't just his. It's ours. The fight for justice starts with believing voices like his. The first time. Type yes if you believe silence should never erase brilliance. Subscribe if this story broke your heart and opened your eyes.